All right, so because we're behind schedule, what I'd like to do is just have this session be as expeditious as possible and take us to 1:30 and no later. So this is the President's Report for this year's convention. And the topic that was decided upon by the OrgCom was first decade, second decade of Platypus, marking 10 years of our organizational history and looking ahead to the next period. I think that this language was already used both in the President's Report that I circulated to the membership ahead of the convention and also in our discussion this morning, the idea that what we're seeing now is a closing of a chapter or putting a bookend, closing the book on a certain period. So what I wanted to do is try to characterize that period in retrospect now. What we're talking about is the cashing out of the millennial left. In other words, if we look at the history of Platypus from its inception as a reading group in 2006 and as an organization, as a formal organization and membership in 2007, what we're really talking about is the beginning of millennial leftism around that time. The new Students for a Democratic Society was mentioned. It was fortuitous for us, but also perhaps not accidental, that the founding convention of the new Students for a Democratic Society took place in the summer of 2006 at the University of Chicago, where we had also begun the reading group in Platypus a few months earlier in the spring of 2006. So we were there. Several of us attended that founding convention of the new SDS as observers. So it begins with that process and really ends with the Sanders campaign and with the Trump election. What does it mean to say that it ends? Well, of course, we were talking earlier about the different phases of Platypus, and I would offer that those different phases map not arbitrarily on changes in the left, but rather necessarily from nodal points in capitalist politics, especially in American, United States capitalist politics. Namely, the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the re-election of Barack Obama in 2012, and now, of course, the election of Trump in 2016. That's what we're really talking about now. Occupy Wall Street was deliberately an attempt to put pressure on the Democrats and on Obama ahead of his re-election in 2012. It came up earlier that we experienced a crisis whose relic, we might say, we find in the boycott letter, namely that we recruited people around Occupy Wall Street, around Occupy Wall Street, not through Occupy Wall Street, but around it and after it, and that these were people who became very frustrated with us in the way that they had become frustrated with the left in general. And when we talk about that frustration, what we're talking about is specifically the idea that, okay, we had 4 years of Obama, and now we know, as if we didn't know already in 2008, but of course these are young people, so they don't know, that there's not going to be a New Deal, there's nothing going to be particularly social democratic or progressive about Obama, and so the idea was a little bit premature, but it very much had the character of the Sanders campaign ahead of time, namely in 2013. Jacobin magazine is also a product of the same impulse. It's the disenchantment with Obama and the idea that disenchantment with Obama was an opportunity for a reinvigorated social democratic politics. So all of this fed more or less into the Sanders campaign last year, and now is experiencing a crisis with the Trump election, meaning the Trump election is actually an opportunity for the entire millennial left generation to reconcile themselves to the Democrats out of resistance to Trump. In other words, whether they declare that or not, it's actually an opportunity for them to turn to the right. Turn not to the right in the conventional sense, but turn to the right in the sense of reconciling themselves to conservative, mainstream status quo politics as the only realm of the possible. Okay, so what does it mean to say that Platypus was designed for the fourth phase, and in some ways Platypus was designed for its second decade? What came up earlier was that actually when we started out, we intended on only existing for 10 years and no longer, right? What did that mean? It meant that, and maybe we were a bit premature about this, it meant that the opportunity that we saw in 2006, 2007, 2008, when we were really establishing ourselves, the opportunity that we saw was what was described earlier as a generational break. What does a generational break mean? It means that we wanted to make the best use of the 1960s, 1970s New Left generation before they vacated the scene, literally. In other words, before they died. Before they were no longer available in a literal sense rather than in a figurative sense. And we wanted to insert ourselves as an alternative to the way that generation usually conducts its education of young people into leftism. Specifically, we wanted to offer, in a sense, an alternative to the 80s generation that was poised to take the reins from the 60s generation once the 60s generation vacated the scene.
And also represented the bad pedagogy of the 60s.
And represent the bad pedagogy of the 60s. But let's remark on this. The first origin of Platypus was around the new SDS, and what about the new SDS gave us some hope for something different. It's that the 60s generation in that moment actually said, we don't want young people to just reproduce us. We don't want young people to take us for granted and just assume what we assume. We want you to be different. Now they backed away from that. In other words, they themselves backed away from that. The 80s generation, the generation of pre-Platypus, if you will, namely of Richard, myself, Spencer, and others, that generation is not actually going to be able to do the same thing that the New Left generation did, either positively or negatively. It's not going to be capable of miseducating in the way that the 60s generation did. It isn't even really trying. And this raises the question of the generational break that we sought to effect happening by default rather than by our own action. So the real question for us is, if Platypus is about hosting the conversation on the death of the left, using the dead left as our interlocutors, what happens when we no longer have the interlocutors upon whom our project was based, namely the 60s generation? The real question is, can the 80s generation, 80s, 90s generation, serve as symptoms, as objects of negative pedagogy in the way that the 60s generation did? Friday night and last night, we got a taste of what this means. Meaning, Friday night was the 80s, 90s generation. I mean, maybe Greg's not that old actually, but Greg Lucero, but he might be a little bit older than a millennial leftist. He certainly is at the older end of the spectrum of millennial leftism, if he's a millennial leftist. And Catherine Liu, of course, is my generation. Last night, by contrast, Brian Palmer and Leo Panich are 60s, 70s generation. In other words, 60s generation with Panich, maybe 70s with Palmer. And interestingly enough, I thought, I'm not sure how you guys found it, and of course, it's how you guys see it that's more important than the way that I saw it. But I actually liked the Friday panel more than last night's panel. Last night's panel made me extremely impatient and made me feel like, look, this 60s generation can't vacate the scene too quickly, right? It's just over now, right? No, and seriously, it's indicated by what Panich had said in the session prior to the closing plenary, namely that Platypus had prompted him to reread Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, which he had not done in 40 years. No, these time frames are actually extremely important, right? Which is shocking in and of itself, that he wouldn't have reread it in 40 years. In other words, that he's been just running for 40 years on his very youthful, completely ignorant and naive misreading of Rosa Luxemburg, that he's just thought that that's what it was all this time. He came back to it and realized that he disagreed with it in a way that he thought that he had agreed with it for 40 years, but of course it was a false agreement to begin with, and so of course now it's a false disagreement, right? But that's what we're talking about. When we say the left is dead, meaning the left doesn't really have any connection already to this history, this is what we mean. Right? We mean the 60s generation didn't really learn this stuff either. They really didn't. They never did. And they certainly don't know it now. So, should we mourn the passing of the 60s generation and the replacement of the 60s generation with the 80s generation as our, in a sense, negative pedagogical presence for our project? No, I don't think so. I think that we're, again, in a situation that we anticipated early on, which is that the project is based on taking the liability and trying to turn it into an asset. That we don't really have a choice, that the generational break, the historical discontinuity, is upon us. It's happening. And as Nietzsche puts it, if something's falling, give it a push. Right? Which sounds really nasty, but actually all that Nietzsche meant by that, because if you really parse out the statement, if something is falling, it's falling anyway. It's falling no matter what you do. Give it a push, what does that mean? It means at least try to make it into your own action, even if it really isn't your action, right? But try to be a subject of it rather than just an object of it, right? Which, it's not to say if something's falling, oh, you could rescue it, or you could give it a push down. No, the point is we can't rescue this stuff even if we wanted to. Even if we wanted to redeem the existing left, we couldn't.
You told us, you said my generation failed.
Right.
What?
You said my generation failed, Leo Panich.
Panich.
He told us that much.
Yeah, he told us that much, and yet he still wanted us to be subject to all of his taboos. Now, this is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the fact that they actually are capable, in a way that the 80s generation is not, of admitting their own failure. But don't think that that actually redeems them, because as it turns out, they want us to share in their failure. They want us to continue that failure. Whereas the 80s generation doesn't realize that there is a failure. They think that being a leftist just means reading certain books and etc. Right? They don't even have the ambition of trying to change the world in the way that Panich can say, we tried and failed. The 80s generation never tried, and so they never failed. Okay, so where does that leave us? I didn't want to talk about the campaign for a socialist party at this meeting at all. But since it came up in the morning session, I do feel like some point of clarification has to be had here with respect to this. Two things about that campaign for a socialist party relative to Platypus. First of all, if you want to know who we're engaging in the campaign for a socialist party in terms of the existing left, it's Greg Lucero. Literally, it's him. Right? So he's a member of the Socialist Party USA here in Chicago, and he's someone who we find to be better than the other people we're dealing with. And so if you'd like to join
Get ready.
the psychotic break with Greg Lucero, you're welcome to join the campaign for a socialist party. Okay? But don't think that it's too appetizing. Right? I don't think it's too appetizing. No, but literally just to disenchant, just to demystify what's going on here. So what does it amount to? Twofold thing. First of all, the entire initiative was conceived by me before the Sanders campaign and before the Trump campaign. So it was predicated on Hillary being elected without any opposition whatsoever. And it was predicated as well on trying to make use of the 60s generation in an entirely different way than Platypus does. Meaning Platypus treats the 60s generation as an object of negative pedagogy. In fact, the Campaign for a Socialist Party, actually my initial idea about it, really, I was going to do it completely independently of Platypus. I was going to do it under a pseudonym. I was not going to have anything to do with Platypus at all. In other words, that you guys would not have even known that I was doing it, because I was going to do it under a different name and everything. Okay? But then I thought, I could use a couple of helpers. Santa needs his elf workshop. Yeah. And so I asked the OrgCom, I said, I'm going to do this thing anyway, and so could I take a couple of members of Platypus, right? But the idea was actually treating the 60s generation in an entirely different way. In other words, treating them as people who had tactical experience organizing that actually is not available with later generations. In other words, the 80s generation actually doesn't have the experience that the 60s generation has, just as pure tactics, to use Kolakowski's language, pure tactics. Okay, so that was one idea. The other idea was to outflank Jacobin.
And the ISO.
Well, no, just Jacobin. Because the ISO doesn't need to be outflanked. The thing is, Jacobin has tried to capture the ISO. Good for them. God bless. That's great. Now, in other words, that's if Jacobin liquidates the ISO into Jacobin, that's great. All right? Because what else?
It's related. I was just like...
Yeah, but no. For me, it was Jacobin because the ISO is the 80s generation. Jacobin is the millennial left. Okay, so the addressing the millennial left in a way entirely different from Platypus. Entirely different from Platypus. Namely, are these people going to become Democrats, or are they going to become depoliticized, or could there be a third option? As it turns out, the Campaign for a Socialist Party is not actually going to be able to do what I thought it could do with either the 60s generation or with the millennial left. But I just wanted to lay that out, that it's not about, it really is a very different relationship to Platypus. Bringing it back to Platypus. What we have to face now in the second decade of Platypus is that young people, college students, 18-year-olds, are not going to have any experience whatsoever of the anti-war movement, of Occupy, or of the Sanders campaign, actually. Right? That we're going to be moving into an entirely new period. So anti-austerity, Occupy, everything that's taken place over the last 10 years is going to be ancient history. It would have been ancient history anyway, but it's going to be ancient history marked by the Trump election. And so that's our challenge, right? Our challenge is that the pedagogical landscape has entirely shifted under our feet. Henceforth, in other words, again, there's going to be this little something, resist Trump, try to get Democrats elected in 2018. There's going to be a little something. But really what we're talking about is talking to young people who have no reference points whatsoever with respect to any of this. Now, of course, there are going to be young people who encounter the left. There have been perennially, always. Right? There's always some random capitalist young person who encounters a Spartacist or encounters some cranky anarchist or encounters an ISOer who will be recruited to those organizations. But this is something very different from the last 10-year period. In other words, in the last 10-year period, and certainly in a period of diminishing returns with respect to this, we saw the left that's always there anyway, we saw it actually experience a little bubble of growth. more at the outset of Platypus as a project than more recently. But we did see something that was different from the way the left operated prior to that, which it will revert back to now. Meaning, what did Brian Palmer say? How do we build socialists? We recruit ones and twos. The left will continue to do that, but that's not what we're talking about. In other words, Platypus is not predicated on that. Platypus was predicated on something else. It was predicated on, again, millennial leftism, which we're now closing a chapter on, if not closing the book entirely on. Now, why do I say that with a fair degree of confidence? I don't see the millennial left reproducing the ISO, reproducing the Spartacist League, or even reproducing the DSA, or even reproducing the DSA, actually. In other words, the left, prior to 2016, is actually not being taken up by the millennial left to continue onward. It's not. So the 80s generation did continue the projects of the 60s generation. But the millennial left is not going to continue that 60s to 80s set of projects. It's not going to continue Maoism. And Greg Lucero is a good example of that, meaning he was a Maoist, but he's not anymore, and he's kind of cashing out in his own way by joining like the most unviable left organization that exists, namely the SPUSA. Right, so he's tried everything, and that's where he ends. He ends with the most unviable of left groups. Right, so they're not reproducing the FRSO. They're not reproducing the ISO. They're not reproducing the RCP. These groups are not really reproducing themselves. So the people who were politicized to the left over the last 10 years are not going to continue the left as it existed up till now. That's the generational break that we're talking about. Okay, so where does that leave us? Platypus, this is the paradox we always have to face. We're too late and too early. And I think that Patrick's presentation this morning kind of captured this about the 20th century and the 21st century. We're too late to be a 20th century project, and we might be a little too early to be a 21st century project. And yet, what other 21st century project is there going to be, actually? All right, so what kind of project is it? Meaning, if we're talking about turning a liability into an asset and being a self-educational project, a pedagogical project, this sort of thing, putting a bookend on the 20th century, what does that allow for? And how might we proceed, right? Because I think it's I hesitated to talk about the second decade of Platypus. I'm more confident talking about the first decade of Platypus, what's coming to an end. I'm not very confident about saying, okay, where do we want to be in 10 years? What are we going to be doing for the next 10 years? But we can at least observe certain things that mark the transition. And it does have to do with this question of Marxism. And it does have to do with the question of, are we going to end up being the last Marxists standing? And what does that even mean? And should we be filled by dread with that prospect and not so eager about it? Right? And that's right. So Richard thinks for us to be the last Marxist standing is a kind of a dreadful and horrific proposition. Again, yes, in a certain sense that's true. In another sense, however, we have to take the liability and turn it into an asset. Meaning, if we're necessarily very poor as Marxists and being the last Marxist standing doesn't really amount to very much, how do we turn that into an asset? I think it came up this morning. We exist to pose the question of what Marxism is or ever was. Right? In other words, we're not the last Marxists in the sense of this is Marxism, but rather we're Marxists in the sense of what was Marxism. And in fact, we've always been that way. We've always been that way, and in some ways we were clearer about that when we started out than we are now. Right? So if you read the founding statements, right, that again, putting a question mark where other people put an exclamation point. Meaning it's not Marxism, but Marxism? What was that again? the fact that we might be able to read Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution and read it actually for the words on the page in a way that someone like Leo Panitch just can't even get the words on the page, that's because it has absolutely no political life. In other words, what prevented Leo Panitch from getting Rosa Luxemburg was politics, was the actual political social reality that distorted Rosa Luxemburg, but also kind of kept it alive in some bizarre way. The clarity that we have is a kind of a false clarity. It's the clarity of not a smog that's gone away, but it's the clarity of a vacuum. Right? In other words, we might be free of atmospheric phenomena, but that means that we're free of all oxygen whatsoever. Right, we can see Marxism more clearly the way a fossil is clear. Right? A fossil is clearer than a living organism in its structure.
Doesn't that, I mean, I know it's a metaphor, but you said that, well, platypus is really just a place to breathe. And if you're talking about like a vacuum where there is no oxygen, there's like a paradox going on there. Because if it's like
Up till now, right? Huh?
It's a spaceship.
Yeah, to complete the metaphor, right? We can see through the vacuum from the spaceship. No, I wouldn't even make that claim. I would say that everything that came up in the morning session needs to be borne in mind, which is to say, we should find ourselves in a very uncomfortable position right now. Being around for 10 years and looking ahead to doing another 10 years of this is actually an indictment.
And getting complimented by Leo Panitch over the course of 5 minutes in one of our panels should make us very uncomfortable.
Right.
Did you speak up, Ed?
Being
Leo Panitch
complimented.
complimented us for 5 minutes instead of speaking at the panel. That should make us very uncomfortable.
Palmer was ironic if we
Yeah.
Well, ambivalent, right? I think that, so another thing about the last 10 years is that when we were dealing with the 60s generation, we were trying to show them that actually the concessions they usually make, which are born of their own lived experience, they're kind of accumulated inhibitions about talking to young people, that they can actually put that all aside and just speak their minds, the degree to which they still have a mind. No, so the Catherine Liu, what you guys responded to positively about Catherine Liu, is she's like, I've been waiting to say this for 20 years, right? Well, you know what? The New Left generation, in a sense, has been waiting to say it for 40 years, but now it's too late. The sad thing about Catherine Liu is that she's been waiting to say it for 20 years, but what she has to say is actually not very much.
Right.
Right. In comparison. All right, so we wanted the 60s generation in particular, but also just the left in general, to realize that they actually didn't have to speak down to young people. Right? That young people were more open to learning than they might have given them credit for. Under certain circumstances. In other words, under circumstances of the anti-war movement, Occupy Wall Street, the financial crisis, throwing things into uncertainty, making things less clear, stirring it up a bit, and therefore allowing them to be much more open and straightforward, to be smarter than they usually are, and more acute than they usually are. So that was our formulation in the first 10 years. Trump is not actually an opportunity for that in the same way. In other words, we might say, oh, Trump is changing things, etc., but actually there's a kind of deadening that comes with Trump. And I think it would have come with Hillary anyway, right? It just comes in a different form now. But Trump's not going to make people smarter or rethink things, right? So the 60s generation could look at the Iraq War and they could say, oh shit, do we have anything to teach young people about being anti-war movement activists, considering how miserable our failure with Vietnam was, right? That they were like chastened by this. They could say, oh, we want to encourage students to be against this war, but we actually don't want them to follow our pattern. again, that was a very brief moment of clarity for them. I don't think that anyone is saying, oh shit, Trump should make us rethink what we've been doing. Nobody's doing that, in fact. And so it won't be what we experience, because even Occupy Wall Street, Laurie, I'll never forget, right? So when Laurie was in London before Laurie was in Berlin, we were getting our chapter going there, and it was at Goldsmiths. And lo and behold, who was teaching at Goldsmiths? But David Graeber, who's one of the ideological godfathers of Occupy Wall Street. And over coffee with Laurie, essentially broke down into tears about not wanting responsibility for teaching the young people. And he just felt
Well,
that
he
the
couldn't deal
burden.
with the activism and the teaching. He was just overwhelmed by both.
Yeah,
The
he-
activist demanding his pedagogy, the activist on campus demanding his pedagogy, and his teaching responsibilities.
Which I can understand, but to break down in tears, right? To break down in tears, to basically say, look, I've put myself out there as this leftist, but actually I can't. Right?
And I still forced him to speak on the panel.
Right?
Yeah, but he was also being rejected by a whole bunch of teaching positions.
No, that was after.
Oh, that was after.
I mean, this was after. He found a home. He found a home. Now, he's made it. He wasn't crying over that. He was crying over success. He was crying over his own success. He didn't want it. Now, the 60s generation also didn't want it, but the 80s generation really never wanted it. They never wanted to change the world, be political, start a party. The 60s generation kind of didn't want it either, but they wanted it much more than anyone who's come later. And you guys, might want something like that in a way that you don't have the inhibitions of the 60s or the 80s generation. But why I brought that up is that, again, we're not going to be experiencing, I don't think, this is a risky statement, we're not going to be experiencing these moments of self-doubt, self-clarity, self-questioning that, however minimally, inform the first 10 years of Platypus on the left. We're not going to be experiencing that. We're rather going to be experiencing, again, what I've brought up many times, something more like the 80s, which is that we keep on keeping on. Meaning we know, and we're just dealing with the right is beating us, but it doesn't challenge us at all. We know exactly what's what, and we just keep on doing the same, and eventually, right, the sun will rise again, the night will be over. Right? In other words, something completely apolitical. The people are just they're leftist by default, meaning, they just sort of, despite everything, they're just going to keep the nose to the grind. Which is an illusion, of course, because they don't stay the same. They imagine that they keep on keeping on, but actually they're not. Right? And I think that I mentioned this in my president's report on the legacy of the 80s, which is that probably the people who stayed leftist under Reagan were the worst and not the best of the preceding generation. Meaning, if you really want to change the world, and you try all these things, and they don't work, and the right takes the initiative instead, you ought to rethink what you're doing. You ought to say, maybe this isn't going to work, and maybe you ought to quit, get a job on Wall Street, like, what's his name? The Spartacist that you met? No, that's another guy. Wes Irwin, right? You left the Spartacist League and joined Wall Street. Or like Martin Nicholas, you choose alcoholism, right? No, for real, right? That's the better option. That the people who continue, like Bob Avakian, are not necessarily the best, right? And not to make fun of Bob Avakian, because actually he's better than most, right? And so the people who will keep on keeping on now, from the millennial left and younger and older people like the 80s generation who just aren't phased at all, who just keep on keeping on, they're not going to be the best, they're going to be the worst. Okay, so where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? If we're keeping on after 10 years of Platypus, does that mean that we're not the best but the worst? Hopefully not. Hopefully not, in the sense that this project has always been negative and not positive. Meaning the project has been wholly different. Meaning we have not claimed We've not imagined that our project is directly about changing the world. And we've acknowledged, not that we are pre-political, but that everything is pre-political. We've acknowledged that. Which means that we're not indifferent to what goes on, but we're also not going to respond to it in quite the same way as activists do. So something that came up also earlier that I wanted to mention and then take some questions, which is that we can now say, okay, 10 years of Platypus, look, actually, we've grown, we've developed, we're an organization, and forget just how much strife and controversy and heartache there's been along the way. Right? So every historical shift affects people, it affects the left, it affected Platypus. Meaning, we did feel like the collapse of the anti-war movement was kind of the end of the world. And we did feel like, okay, the financial crisis, can we meet this kind of spurious new Marxism and Obama's election? We have felt every change as a mortal threat. And we have lost members. We have had little controversies within Platypus. Actually, less than other organizations. In the same time period, other organizations experienced.
Survived the extension of the
Yeah, they've gone through actually much worse controversies. And what I would say is that our ability to weather the changes better than others has to do with the fact that we were able to moderate our perspective and ambition, that we kind of knew what we were doing more clearly than the ISO or other groups that experienced such shocks. Or like the SWP in the UK, which is now evidently just banned from campus everywhere. Yeah, so they're just finished, right? Right. Yeah, the Marxism conference. Yeah, and the ISO hasn't quite gone through that, but they've actually gone through that. They had their own like rape scandal or whatever, because this is the form that it takes, because people can't deal with the ideological stuff, so it takes on a kind of neurotic, psychological character, a phantasmic character. So what's remarkable about the Trump stuff, right, because I tried to be as provocative as I could be, right, I tried to stir the pot as much as possible, and actually, we didn't have a big controversy, did we? I think that doesn't say anything about us. I think it says something about the Trump phenomenon. And why, therefore, I don't think that anti-Trump activism is going to be like the anti-war movement or like Occupy Wall Street. In other words, I don't think that it actually challenges the left, and therefore it didn't really challenge us in a way that's provoked a crisis. And I think that's significant. That is significant. It doesn't say anything about us. I don't think that the Trump phenomenon is really causing a crisis on the left beyond Platypus either. And I think that is remarkable, right? It means that actually this is something different from George W. Bush invading Iraq or people being upset with Obama not giving us a new deal in his first 4 years and doing Occupy Wall Street. I think that, in fact, there's a way in which something very dramatic has happened with Trump, but actually, in a sense, nothing has happened with Trump. Right? And our sobriety about that is simply our sobriety in recognizing that. Right? In other words, when the left says, oh, look, fascism, look at Trump, actually, it's because they want more to be happening than is actually happening. Now, what that means down the road, it's unclear. It is unclear. And I don't think that we should expect the next 10 years to be like the last 10 years. And we are faced, we should be uncomfortable, and we are faced with a deep challenge in terms of the negative pedagogical model that we've established up to this point. I think that we're not in crisis now, but we can look ahead to a crisis of diminishing returns. And the pattern that we followed, turning the internal pedagogy outwards, turning to Marxism, this kind of thing, it can only take us so far. It can only take us so far. Richard?
Well, I mean, the problem, and this is a discussion we've been having for 7 years,
Speak up.
is the problem is that the pedagogy necessarily becomes and part of the problem that becomes clearer and clearer.
Stand
Part
up.
of part of the problem,
Uh-huh.
okay, of pedagogy about the left and the history of the 20th century, is that the nature of the pedagogy keeps expanding,
Mhm.
right? Because one can take less and less for granted, and therefore there's a way in which Platypus education in some ways starts to substitute for a general education.
So we started out as essentially a meta-commentary on the left. But you can't have a meta-commentary on something that doesn't exist, right? So in other words, we have to, in a sense, do the thing, the commentary, and the meta-commentary all at once, right? And that's, whereas when we started out, we could essentially be the, oh yeah, all of that, but think about this, right? And when there's less of that going on, then we can no longer be parasitic in the way that we were.
Can you put some flesh on that? I mean,
Anti-imperialism. So we started out with anti-imperialism. In other words, we could say,
how that affects our organizational activities. So you're saying
Right.
we will be keep on speaking on so like panels, tripod, with different topics, or like with sort of different approach to what does that
so
mean?
topics used to be given by activism.
We need to generate topics for, we need to think about what the tripod is sacred. I think that one of the things you saw with this protection, one of the things you saw is the protection limits on panels,
Yep.
right?
Panels aren't as productive as they used to
And
be.
so we have to think about what that means. So I think that this is something we have seen coming for several years. We have to think about the pedagogy of members. Like a large part of the idea of the original pedagogy is bringing people to the lab. And there's nothing to bring people to, right? If it's not like showing the animal in the wild, it's showing the skeleton in a museum. You're dealing with a different set of problems.
Absolutely.
We need to think about the way the discussions, for example, this is a different discussion, so discussions about history and having this conversation about like memory of 1789 and 1917 last night. So there's a way in which a conversation about the meaning of history, right? So you ask, what is the meaning of politics? It's also a question about what is the meaning of history, right? Now, previous generations of leftists didn't have to address questions of that fundamental philosophical nature because they could more or less take for granted a certain framework and they addressed more concrete issues.
Here's the difference. So during the Cold War, 1789 would have been raised in a deeply ambivalent way, right? So 1789 would have been the great French Revolution that gave us modern freedom, but be careful because it also gives us the danger of totalitarianism. Whereas now, with postmodernism, there's a question of whether anything took place at all in 1789. And
Right, that's-
freedom, not freedom, the danger of freedom is not even raised.
Right, so that
right?
was an example I brought up. So right in the mid 20th century, you had on one hand
The Cold War, they had to
the
educate people.
Revolution, people like Palmer, and then you had French scholars and so forth. And that's a discussion that one could only wish that you could have in the academy.
Today.
Right, because it's like so, but the other the other area where I think we see this, and it's a peculiar symptom, is the perennial discussions about philosophy that then get pushed off and the way that manifests. So I think that the impulse towards philosophy and Platypus, that is both part of the pedagogy, but then there's an attempt to limit it, is also a result, and I see this in myself, a result of political
Yes,
regression.
yes.
Right? It's one goes back to ever more fundamental questions.
Or like enlightenment mongering is that too.
Well, enlightenment mongering is a thing, a phenomena external to politicalism, right? The discussion about the Enlightenment, liberalism, the whole conversation about Israel. I mean, I don't want to get into
Right.
specific, but what I'm saying is that I do think we are going to end up moving more towards a period of internal pedagogy. We have to think about the ways that our pedagogy has become somewhat formulaic, and our manner of doing the tripod.
Right. So the challenge with hosting the conversation on the left is, of course, are the panelists good? Do we get anywhere with them? What do we do? How can we push something that's kind of a little bit inert? Teo and then Chris.
I was thinking about this problem. We are left-centric.
Louder.
We are left-centric in our approach. We do not focus on the social reality, but on the left, and what happens when the left shrinks or degenerates or the new left is passing by.
Or is it self-disengaged from social reality?
Exactly. But as we have observed, the ideological obstacles remain. I mean, the left degenerates, but look at Craig. Look at this ideology that what he learned from the previous generation. So the obstacle is there and it's huge, and someone has to address it, despite the fact that the left degenerates.
I mean, it would be a shame to say people are going to freak out no matter what happens in capitalism, and so we're going to have to deal with them. In other words, that someone or other's going to turn into a human torpedo in the face of whatever happens, right? They're going to hurl themselves at a bank or at a tank or whatever, But of course, that's not what we really mean by the left, right? And so, like, when we look at someone like Greg Lucero, it's kind of like, is this leftism, right? Which is really the kind of question that Marcuse and Adorno would have asked about the 60s students.
Right.
It would have been like, okay, these kids are upset because, napalm is upsetting, but, but is this leftism, like, at all, right? And Marcuse is like, well, no, it isn't, but it could be. And Adorno's like, nah, right? Chris.
I want to keep on talking about the reevaluation of our approach to hosting the conversation in relation to a scene where the left is very placid or vacant. It seems like the Orcom's been trying to address the situation by saying we're going to make a turn towards socialism. So it seems like there is a kind of direction that the Orcom wants to try to
Squeeze the left for its last little bit of juice. Like, it's like, okay,
so what does that mean? Like,
we addressed you as leftists, we addressed you as Marxists, but what about socialism? What do you think? Like, it haunted the conversation last night.
yeah.
Meaning, okay, these guys talk about this and that, and the working class, and self-organization, and
It's in the air.
right?
Talk of forming socialist parties in the air. You still.
But you know that it's in the air only until the midterm election next year. Once the Bernie crowds are unelected, it won't be in the air much. And so, but I kind of wanted to say, okay, Leo Panish, we're kind of talking about means for achieving socialism. We're kind of disputing, do you need the Leninist vanguard party? Do you need a party state? What do you need? But really, what do you even mean by socialism? Like, what are you talking about? What's the ends that you have in mind, right? Like, what do you want, right?
My question is that a new kind of shift in our approach? Is that still bound up with the same methods that we're going to hosting the conversation?
Yes.
Or is that part of a plan of like reevaluating our approach to how we do that?
I think necessarily it might be a bit of both, but it is kind of like trying to get the last juice
What
out.
I found most troubling about yesterday's events, about our panels yesterday, like everybody was prepared for the Trump panel. Everybody just had questions to ask, great questions. They were talking
You
about...
mean us?
Yeah. But once we got in there with Brian Palmer in the morning, there was nobody was prepared to actually interrogate him about the history of American Trotskyism.
Right.
Like, it was basically Richard and Spencer who asked questions that actually got him to talk about what his book was about and why he does his research. All the younger members, and this includes older members, right, were just like, well, how does this relate to the present? And that was the extent of their ability to sort of articulate these questions. And I felt like the same thing happened with 1917, where there weren't enough questions about 1917, right? people were, you guys
We
actually
weren't
like,
prepared, yeah.
you guys actually had a discussion independent of the audience.
Right.
And so it's going to take both like our it's like a matter of like how do we organize our self-education for incoming members? Like how do we actually get newer members to
be able
learn
to.
about the new left?
To
I
be
mean,
able
next
to.
year's the 50th anniversary of 1968. Like, and are we going to just like put 1968 up on a panel like we did last night? We can't. We have to be prepared to actually interrogate them. And perhaps that just means a lot of like us writing articles, us doing teach-ins.
Mhm.
Like the thing about
To do preparation,
Mhm.
to discipline yourself.
right. I mean, the thing about the Greg and Jeremy proposal was that there was a necessity for something like that.
Mm.
That we did need to sort of perfect ourselves as
Better students.
to become better students, to be able to teach learning.
I think
Right.
the way that I responded to Jeremy and Greg's proposal back in the day was I said, look, the illusion about becoming the next generation of Marxists and the next generation of public intellectual leftists and et cetera, is that it was kind of I would say a youthful error, which is the idea that at a certain point you cease to be a student. And so what I pointed out is, well, what is a scholar? In other words, what's a tenured faculty member? Like, who's Robert Pippin? He's a student of philosophy. He never stopped being a student. And that they actually weren't mature enough to recognize that they wanted to say, oh, we're not students anymore. We're teachers. And it's like, no, to be a teacher means that you're always a student, actually. And they just hadn't realized that. If we address that kind of need in the proper spirit, in other words, if you realize that when you write an article, you're writing it to learn, not just to propagate something that you think you already know, right? To prepare a teaching means that you're learning something. And you're learning something not only ahead of it, but you're learning it in doing it and afterwards. If you have that, yeah, sure, right? Then we could do more of that, like learning through teaching, but teaching as a form of learning. Right? If we understand that that's what that means.
I just wanted to make a brief comment about the Ben, Greg, Jeremy, and I think it's a little unfair. The Ben, Greg, Jeremy.
Ben Shepherd, yeah.
I mean, and again, I think it's a little unfair to Jeremy Cohen, which represents rationality with that. But
Come on,
way,
Richard.
Just go ahead.
The way that narrative has been presented historically is that they wanted to make Platypus the school for public intellectual, and that's what we fought against. The truth is that formulation really masked what was, in a sense, a difference of political vision.
Well, now that's clear, but at the time they would have denied it. In other words, at the time, I said, look, you just want to be liberal social democrats, and they were like, no, we want to be revolutionary Marxists, and now they joined the DSA.
Right. I know that they would have denied it, but I think that in presenting that, in terms of our own history, I think that narrative of they wanted to present public intellectual, and I think that confused me in Platypus about ultimately what the
Wouldn't it be more confusing, however, to say that they, as opposed to other members, wanted to become liberal social democrats? Because don't we all?
Yes.
Don't we all? I mean, I can't claim, I myself personally cannot claim, that if some kind of liberal social democracy a la Michael Harrington was viable and could exercise power in the United States, that I wouldn't be attracted to that? Of course.
Right, but what I'm saying is that tied up in that description, right, it is a whole bundle of assumptions about the political possibilities of the present.
Right.
And what one's political horizon is, and strategies to pursue them. Right? And I think the narrative of they wanted to turn Platypus into
Grad school for Marxists.
a grad school for Marxists.
No, they would have been better if they had actually wanted
But
to do
what I'm
that.
saying is, I think that short circuits a self-understanding of Platypus of what the genuine problems are.
So
That's
offer the alternative.
I think that in a certain sense, of course, Platypus is about training Marxist intellectuals. Not that everyone in Platypus is going to become a Marxist intellectual, but obviously we are in a fundamental sense a pedagogical project. And one of the biggest failures of Platypus is the question of to what extent have the people who are the vast majority of people in the room, who are the students, right? Do they then feel able to reproduce Platypus pedagogically, right? In other words, it's the sense that people have that they never sort of grow up from being students to being adequate teachers. This is something that's haunted Platypus, right? And
As a professional teacher, though, I can tell you this, and I'm sure that Spencer could also say this, which is that you suddenly realize that you are a teacher. In other words, talk about faking until you make it, right? That it's like, you know, you kind of wonder, am I just faking it? Like, you know, am I ever going to be as good a professor as Moise Plastone? And it's like, no, I'm already much better. The thing is that it's an imperceptible change.
okay, but first, I don't think that there's anybody in Platypus who has ever felt I am now as good a teacher of Marxism as Christian.
Well, we'll get there.
Okay, but
We don't
certainly
want to measure up
certainly
our successor failures.
our ambition.
It's 1:49.
Oh, shit.
It's 1:49.
All right, we need to wrap up. What I'd say about, you know, just in terms of what Richard was just laying out, I think that Richard plays a crucial role with respect to raising the anxiety about what Platypus members are actually learning in classes. I think that we should always have that apprehension, right? Now, the funny thing about that is that, of course, he's asking it as someone who's trying to teach people. And it's a different kind of question for, in a sense, a student to ask. But I myself, and I think Richard at his best moments, thinks of himself as a student of Platypus, right? And I try to discipline myself in terms of, am I learning anything anymore through this project? And I think that's the proper attitude, rather than we're speaking this language and are the kids ever going to understand it, right? Because really, you know, my point, one thing that I've learned as a teacher is that I'm teaching something and students can understand it whether or not I really understand it. Whether or not I myself really understand it, they can still understand it. Right? So it doesn't have to be this apprehension of, I think, you know, one uncharitable thing that I'll say about Richard is that once he analogized Platypus, he said it's like teaching chimpanzees sign language and releasing them in the wild and returning 10 years later, and they're still signing, but they're not saying anything. Right? Because that was his fear with Platypus. Right? And whenever he hears what he calls Platypus jargon, his fear is that you guys are chimps that we're teaching to sign, and then we'll let you free, and then it turns out you won't be signing at all, it'll just be some nervous tip. Right?
No, but even that fear gets reproduced among younger members.
Let me say one thing.
Can we get
All right.
Stefan? Can we Stefan said his hand?
Okay.
15.
Order, Jesus.
Okay, so if we're talking about that we're the last Marxists, I think this is not the sense as Trotsky is the last man standing of the Second International, but just as Nietzsche's last man. And what Patrick said, I really would like that to be Platypus being the prehistory of Marxism in the 21st century, but also so far we are mired into this non-history which persists, and sometimes it seems like when we're waiting for the rebirth of the left, it's like waiting for the Heideggerian event, which will come and change everything. And I guess we cannot jump out of this. And I felt with Catherine Liu presenting that our members wanted it. You know, like we want to break out of this, we want to break free, and that's where the 60s come back in. That's where our Spartacism shows like, okay, so they don't get it, but we don't get it either, but still we get it much better. That's why we need to lecture, and I think we need to turn the pedagogy outward, but we cannot forget what we learned in the last 10 years that exactly we are students, and we cannot show up and be like, okay, so this is the real shit, and even though if we're saying like we don't have the program sound like, and anyone thinking like, but they sound like they have the program, they just say it's a past program.
That's right. Because as Spartacists, for instance, they don't have a program because they say, well, it's premature for us to have a program. But they still act like they have a program. Even though they formally say the reason we don't have a program is that it's premature to have a program. They have their own sobriety and acknowledgement of the pre-political character, but they still browbeat others and their members as if they're fighting on the barricades. Spencer?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really don't like. To me, Richard objects to the way that we talk. Objects to the way that we talk about Platypus that Jeremy, etc. want to turn it into Marxism graduate school, but then he proceeds to talk about it as Marxism graduate school. That the issue will never be to teach students to reproduce what we say.
Right.
That cannot be the point. The point is, to teach them to learn how to learn.
Right.
Right, and they're gonna, when they, to the extent that people grow within Platypus as students of Platypus, they do so as representatives of their own time. And we're helping to organize their experience of the present. It's only on the basis of the traction that they get with respect to their own time. It will never be the way that Chris understands it.
Right.
It will never be that way.
That's right.
It will be a new generation of thinking, and it's why it's not just about pedagogy. It's tied to the issue of the past 10 years and how we have developed a body of activity.
A way of learning.
That we call the tripod, right? That's why it's a problem that the questions in the fora aren't good. Right, here we are, we foreground the reading group. That's the first foot forward in every chapter. We do it, we're doing it all over the place. But the basic point of that is to understand the history of Marxism as it bears upon the present, which has been staged live in a forum.
Right.
Which we're hoping to respond to in advance. Right, and so it's those sorts of intersections that we need to think about. Rather than, obviously at one level, biologically, Chris is always going to be people's teacher. Even the teachers I reject are always going to be my teachers. Moishe Stone is always going to be my teacher. All of my teachers will always be my teachers because they brought a different kind of experience to bear, and I learned what I learned even by objecting to them. So I think that that it's very tricky to think about pedagogy in this isolated way.
Right. Pam, and then that will be it. Actually,
I agree wholeheartedly. I just want to rescue Richard's point.
Okay.
It's getting lost. And
Okay.
Make sure
Louder.
that we hear. I want to make sure that we hear Richard's point. We don't want our activities, our ways of learning, our modes of learning to become ossified, institutionalized, to the point that they're no longer tools for us to understand the present. And they're only just caricatures that people can repeat. That's the fear, and I think it's real. And we should hear, we do want people to feel as if they can at least learn by doing the teaching, right? You're still learning by the doing of the teaching, but you have to try to teach. You
That's
have
right.
to want to try to teach.
So, just to wrap up the discussion, if we're looking at the challenge of the next 10 years as a historical phenomenon and not just a phenomenon of organizational inertia, then what we're talking about is we develop techniques for engaging the left as an educational object that may no longer apply as the left itself changes and vacates the scene. That's what we're really talking about. And the challenge, therefore, will be to find new ways of learning, new ways of organizing the educational experience. We should never, however, lose sight of the fact that it's fresh for 18-year-olds in a way that it can't be for 30-year-olds.
Or that we've actually learned something.
Yeah, well that's, all right. So it's not as if we've learned something and then we proceed from there, right? But we need to find new ways of learning. My own attitude towards this is that new people always make you see things in a new way.
Yeah.
And that therefore, that's always the opportunity for learning for our experienced members, is to essentially, time and time again, confront the fact of how little you can take for granted. which means relearning or unlearning or questioning what you've learned, right? Because you're seeing it with a new set of parameters, a new set of groundings. You can't actually take anything as given. Like nothing's been established. Nothing is actually existing as a foundation. So I think that our members start losing sight of like what we're doing when they're no longer dealing with young people. But that's just my provisional hypothesis. You know, I'm open to being challenged on that more. But I do think that that is always the fundamental problem, is that when you stop dealing with young people, then it becomes pointless. Then it becomes pointless. All right, so we're going to take
30 minutes.
30 minutes for lunch and then come back for the organizational meetings.
30.